Welcome to episode 5 of our navigation series. Today, we're going to be building out the scene with the Villa Savoy model and explore world-aligned textures for our materials. This is all part of the third space nav template, but I'm building it here from scratch so you understand exactly how it works. Grab your coffee and let's dive into the system. Jumping into our project, we can see that our scene is pretty empty. I think it's best that we finally actually build out the scene first. So I'm going to be working with the Villa Savoy model. I found this here on Sketchfab, so I'll include the link below if you want to download this exact model to follow along. And in this case, I'm going to download just the smallest size, just because I'll be replacing this with my own textures in a little bit. So heading over to where that folder is, I'm just going to drag and drop this GLB file, let it import in, and then I'm just going to quickly save all. And let's see if we can just drag and drop this into the scene. Let's just focus first on getting this model to look a little bit better, because you can see that there's some baked shadows in the material, just not looking the most realistic. So to get started, I'm going to head back into my materials folder. I'm going to right click and create a new material and call this m_master material. Now, if you already have materials created or you're using Quixel materials, for example, you can skip the step and move on to the next chapter. I'll have it pasted below. But building your own master material, I find, is good practice, since you get to set up parameters that you're actually going to use, and you can create a bunch of different variations and really just understand how these systems work. Now that we've created the master material, let's actually figure out what textures we're going to need. So looking at the building itself, we're probably going to need a plaster texture, some kind of floor texture, maybe some concrete tiles. And for this, you can either use Quixel Megascans. So if you've purchased or you've been using Quixel for a while, you can just head over to Quixel Bridge and search for any of those materials from there. Just have to log in. So using Quixel Bridge, we can search up, concrete and be able to pick any of the materials that we think look good. In this case, let's say, for example, I wanted to grab in this case, if I'm looking at this building, we can see that we sort of have this concrete tile texture. So I can search up tile, grab one that looks appropriate, download it, add it to my project. And then you can see that I can literally just drag and drop this material instance right onto it. But we can also see that this is where a problem comes up. Models, especially from architecture softwares, and when you're working with clients, don't always have the best UVs. And you get a lot of these overlapping UV maps that create a little bit of a mess like this. So in that case, you're gonna have to go through a lot of work to either fix the UVs yourself, or what we're gonna do is actually create a master material that uses something called a world aligned texture that makes it really easy, since you can basically ignore the UVs already in the project. So I'm gonna show you how to get started with that. Let's grab a bunch of textures. So you can either grab it from Quixel, or if you don't have access to the Quixel assets, we can use a website called Polyhaven, which does have a bunch of free textures. So I've already picked out a couple: this gravel embedded concrete, a green metal rust texture, a basic plastered wall texture, and these brown floor tiles that I'm gonna mess around with. And I've downloaded them and organized them nicely into respective folders. And this just makes it easier for me to reuse them in the future. So what I can do is, going over to my materials, I'm going to create a new folder called textures. Double click to open that up. And then I'm going to drag and drop all of these textures. And let's do the same for the rest of the materials. And then we can save all. And just for naming convention, I like to add a little T underscore in front of my texture. Now we can either name these all individually like I did there, or we can create a quick script that allows us to rename these all in one go. So I'll show you quickly how to do that. If you head over to your blueprints folder, right click, go over to editor utilities, and we'll create an editor utility blueprint. And this one can be an asset action utility. And we'll call this BP_editor utilities. This allows us to create repeatable scripts that we can actually use within the editor to make life a little bit easier. So I'll create a function. We're going to call this one add prefix to string. Since we're adding a prefix to the string name of our textures. And clicking the add prefix to string, we're going to add a new input, and we're going to call this one prefix. So this is what we're going to add in front of our existing name, and I'm going to change the variable type to a string. Then I'm going to get selected assets. For each loop, so that we iterate through all of our selected assets. And then I'm simply going to rename asset. Now, for the actual name of the asset, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the display name of the asset, and then I'm going to append. And I'm going to append our prefix to that asset. So I want to have a T underscore and then return that as the new name of our asset. So simple enough. Heading back to our textures, I can select all of these textures. I can now right click this, go to scripted asset actions, add prefix to string. I'm going to add a capital T underscore to my texture names and pressing OK. We can see now all of them have been quickly renamed with the correct prefix. And you can use these editor utilities for whatever your heart's desires. I like using it for a lot of this sort of organization stuff. Let's create our world aligned material so that we can avoid dealing with, remapping the UVs for all of our assets. Now, I will say that if you do have the time, remapping the UVs is good practice, but this is just a way to get around that. So going into our master material, the core of a world aligned material is to use something called a world aligned texture node. For this, you need a texture object feeding our texture into this. We need to specify what our texture size is. And there are a couple other parameters that you can mess around with as well. We're just going to focus on these first two. So we'll grab a texture object and we're going to turn this into a parameter and call this one base texture and feed that into our texture object. Now for our texture size, we can see here that it's requesting a vector 3. So we can hold V on our keyboard and left click to create a vector 3 parameter and call this one texture size. You can also simply just right click and search up vector parameter and it'll do the same thing. And we'll feed the RGB into our texture size. Now we can straight just feed this directly into a named reroute node and I'll call this base color. And then going to comment this out as base texture / color. And we're calling it base color just because that is what our material is looking for here. And then I'm going to make this the same color, even though that's a very ugly green. And pulling out from our base color, we can just type in base color. And this named reroute node just feeds in from here right into our master material base color input. I do this for organization just so you can kind of move this around. You don't have to worry about your material graph looking like spaghetti code. Now we can quickly just copy and paste this for our normal and roughness maps, and I'll rename these accordingly. And we'll also want to make sure that we rename our texture object parameters to normal texture and roughness texture. And then for our named reroute node, we want to make sure that we appropriately name them color and roughness respectively. And for visibility's sake, we can change the colors of these to be more distinguishable. And I'm copying and pasting by shift right clicking the color and then shift left clicking to paste. So we can now quickly just drag and drop normal. Oops. Normal, scroll up to get our named reroute node, and then roughness. And then for metallic and specular, we're going to create scalar parameters. So holding S on my keyboard and left clicking, I can create a scalar parameter. and we'll call this one metallic, and the other one specular. Now, if you have textures for these assets as well, feel free to put them in. For the materials that I have so far, I do not. So we're just going to use basic values from 0 to 1. And I can save that, and that is our very basic master material created. Now, to actually apply these materials, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder. We're going to call these material instances. And then I'm going to click my master material, right click, create a material instance. And we can call this something like MI for material instance. And let's start off with our concrete tile. And I'm going to move this material instance over here. And I'm going to quickly create the other material instances that I'm going to want to use. So I'll rename this one actually to floor tiles. And then we're going to control D to duplicate, and we can call the next one concrete, and then we'll call the next one MI_plaster, and the last one MI_steel for that rusted metal that we have. Now, for the materials themselves, we can look at some reference images, and we can see that our tiles, at least on the interior, are these orangey tiles that are slightly varied in color. So we're going to try to recreate that by heading over to our floor tile. And with our floor tile open, what we can do is I'll go over to our content drawer on the bottom left, go to our materials, go to our textures, and find our brown floor. And under the texture parameter values, we can check mark to enable all of these, and then simply drag our base color over, and then we can drag our normal texture over, control space to open up our content browser again, and then drag our roughness texture over. And then for our texture size, we want to set these values to something a bit bigger, since the texture size is actually respective to the world size. So our texture size in this case could be something like 250 by 250 by 250. And now if I take that material that we've just created and drag and drop it in here, we can see that a lot of our UV issues are already very quickly fixed. Texture is actually pretty close to what I wanted, but it's still a little bit dull. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little color tint to this. And we can do that by going back into our master material and adding a couple extra steps in our base texture and color. So I'll drag this out to make a little bit more space. So what I'm going to do is I want to basically multiply my existing texture. So get a multiply node, and I want to multiply this by some kind of tint value, which we're going to use as a vector parameter. So again, holding V on my keyboard while left clicking. I'll call this tint. So we're multiplying our texture by a tint color. And then I want to be able to actually control the strength of the tint, because I don't want my entire texture to go, let's say, like fully black or fully red or whatever. So what I can do in this case is use a lerp node, a linear interpolate. And for my A value, I can use my X, Y, Z texture. And for my B value, I can use this multiplied version. And then for the alpha, we can create a scalar parameter, call this tint strength. And again, that's me pressing S on my keyboard while left clicking and putting that into the alpha. And just to kind of show you what I'm doing, I'll preview this node. So we can see that when our alpha value is 0, it's basically using just the existing base color, so whatever value is in A. And if I switch this to 1, it fully uses the tint value, which is being fed into B right now. So I can change this to something like, red. And our tint strength, because it's at a value of 1, is now applied to B. Now if I go 0.5, we can see that it's now a mixture between our sort of light green minty color that we have on our base texture object and our tint color. So this allows us to control how much of the color we really want to come through on our texture. So for now, I'll set this to 0 and we'll default this back to black. And then if for whatever reason I don't want to use a texture and I just want to use a basic color for what I'm feeding into our base color input, I will drag this out and use another lerp. And let's just create another vector parameter and we'll call this base color. So this will give us the option in the future, if we just want to ignore a texture object entirely and we just want to use a color, we can do it this way. And here I'll create another scalar parameter called color strength. And we'll spell that correctly. Okay, and we can feed this out into our base color. And now if I go over to my nav scene and my floor tile, you'll see I'll have a bunch of extra options on my right-hand side now. So for tint color, we're going to turn that on and I'll set the alpha to 1. And then we'll use a value like, 1 for red. I want this to be sort of tinted a little orangey. So here are some values that we can get it to tint a little bit orange. And then for our tint strength, I can turn this up to what feels about right. So maybe something like 0.6. And I know that this is a little bit more saturated than our image, but we're trying to stylize it a little bit as well. So that's already looking a little bit better, at least to me. And I can quickly just do the same and just drag and drop this down. Curious. So it appears as though this model does not actually have a floor. No worries. What I'll do is I'll create a new floor by just quickly going into our basic shapes, grab a cube, and then going into our top view, just quickly model this out. So all I'm doing here is just roughly approximating the scale that the floor needs to be. Ideally, you would fix this in your modeling software, but since this is just a model that we have fetched online, I'll do this quickly in Engine. And now back into our material instances, we can drag this out. And that already looks a lot better. Okay, now let's repeat this process for the rest of our materials in the scene. So going over to our concrete, open up concrete, plaster, and steel. I'm going to nest these in a smaller window so that I can just simply go to my textures over here. And for each of them, find the appropriate texture and apply them. So starting off with concrete, we can use this button here, which uses selected asset from content browser. And then we'll copy over our texture size from before, which was 250 on the X, 250 on the Y, and 250 on the Z coordinates. So I can just copy and paste that in our texture size. And then if we want to mess around with the tint, we can change this to maybe a full white, let's say, for example, if you want it to be a little bit lighter. And then let's control the tint strength. Then do the same for plaster. And with our textures done, let's apply them to our scene. And you can see here, when I apply one of the materials, we actually have that material disappearing entirely. And that's because this is a one-sided material. So if I go to the other side, we can see that our door is now visible again. But if I go back around, it disappears. So that one is a simple enough fix. We can find the materials that it applies to and head over to our material property overrides and make this a double-sided material. Now, and it looks like I'm gonna need to make all of these double-sided materials since this model that I'm using is pretty simple planes. So I'm just gonna do that in the actual master material itself. So going over to our details, we can just double click two-sided equals true. And now we finally have a roof. Great. And now we can apply the concrete texture on the roof. Maybe we can also apply it to, oh, that one does not look as nice. So maybe I'll leave those for now. They can say the originals. Now, after we've applied all these materials, one thing that is looking weird still is our floor. So going into our master material, we can see that we currently have our world aligned texture being used for our normal. Now there is a specific world aligned normal node that we can use instead. And this should fix any issues that we are having regarding weird shadows and lighting on our world aligned material. So pressing save, we can see that now this looks a lot better. Okay, now we want to create a quick glass material by heading over and creating a new master material called m_glass. We're going to change this one from a blend mode of opaque to translucent. We'll make this one two-sided as well. And we want to make sure that we have refraction set up by typing in refraction in our details and changing it from a method of none to index of refraction. Now what we can do is create a vector3 parameter by pressing V on our keyboard and left clicking, and we'll call this base color, and this will be the base color of our glass. Next, we'll change our lighting mode to surface translucency volume, and then we can create a couple of scalar parameters. So we'll create one for metallic, set that to a value of 1, and connect that up. And then I'll do Control D for roughness, set that to a value of 0. Create another one for opacity. And this is what actually controls the translucency. For our glass material, we'll set that to 0.05, and you can change that to whatever you see fit. Maybe for glass, we could do 0.15 or something. And then next we'll want to set something for our refraction index. So we can create a lerp node. And then for our A value, we're going to use a constant. And we'll set this to a value of 1. And our B value will be the index of refraction that is typical for glass, which is 1.52. And this value can change depending on what type of translucent material you're creating, like water or smoke or anything else. And then for our alpha, we'll use a Fresnel. And connect that up. And what a Fresnel does is it basically gives us a darker edge and then a lighter interior. So a little bit more to what glass actually looks like. Okay, now we're basically good to go. I can change this to be like a slight blue tint, and you can see immediately that it's looking a lot more like glass now. And now if I create a material instance of this called mi_glass exterior. And now when we apply it, we can see that it's looking pretty decent, and we can mess around with some of these settings in the material instance. So if we think that it's a little too blue, for example, we can turn that value to be a little bit lighter. So it's just a tint of blue. And we can also set our opacity to be more opaque or less opaque, depending on what effect you're going for. Okay, so let's finish up the rest of the materials around this. So we can see that the model is still giving us a little bit of trouble. So since this is a pretty simple area, I'm just going to remake it quickly with some cube volumes. There we go, looking much better now. And we can apply some grass around this as well. And this grass is really bothering me, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna quickly add a landscape to my scene. So we'll go over to our landscape, and we can create a smaller landscape, so something maybe 15 by 15. And then just going back into my selection mode, I'm going to delete the old landscapes that we were using. Lift up my current landscape so it's just hiding that grass layer over there. And if you'd like, you can go into the landscape tool and do a little bit of sculpting, lift some stuff, so you don't have as uniform of a starting point to work out with. And then, maybe smooth out some of these areas so they're not as intense. And we can add a little bit of noise. Just add a little bit of variation. You can see there's little ripples now along the edges. So I'm gonna create a very basic material for our landscape. So right clicking, going over to the material tab, and then we're gonna name this m_landscape. Now for our base color, we're gonna grab a landscape coordinate. And then we're going to multiply that. And we're going to create a scalar parameter by pressing S on our keyboard while left clicking. And we'll call this size grass. And then we'll feed that into a texture sample. And we can see I found a very basic grass texture online. Nothing too crazy. And it's pretty low quality, but it's okay. I'm going for more of a stylized toon vibe. So I'm going to just simply drag and drop this into my textures folder under the materials. And now for texture sample, we can grab T_green grass. Now what we'll do is we'll add a hue shift, feed our RGB output into the texture, and I'm going to copy and paste our size grass, rename this to hue shift, and this will control the actual hue shift percentage. And then we'll feed this out into a blend overlay, and for our blend value we can hold V and left click, and that'll create a vector parameter, and we'll call this color grass. And we can set this value to something like maybe 0.5 for everything. Gives us a nice gray. And then feed that into another multiply node. Copy over our scalar parameter, and we're going to rename this one subsample color, so SS color. And then I'm going to feed this directly into our base color. And if I control this SS color value, it basically controls the intensity of our initial colors over here. Now for our metallic, specular, and roughness, what we'll do is we'll just give these constants values, nothing too crazy. So holding 1 on my keyboard and clicking 3 times, we can create 3 constant nodes. Give metallic a value of 0, specular a value of 0, and roughness a value of 1. Okay, so now we have our base color and our MSR. And now I can right click, create a material instance of our landscape, and call this mi_landscape. Move it over to our material instances folder. And then left clicking our landscape, scroll down, find our landscape material, and drag and drop this on. And then we can save these changes so that it gets reflected in our material instance. So for the size of the grass, I'm going to go negative 0.464. So you get sort of this little pixely vibe, a little bit more stylized. And I think I'll leave the rest of the values at their default, maybe hue shift at 0. And now we have a landscape material that's a little bit more pleasing to the eyes. We could probably smooth out our landscape itself, since there are some deformities it looks like. But overall, much more pleasing than what we had before. And to give you context, if I drag and drop this out on our landscape, which is our old material, yeah, doesn't look as nice. And that wraps it up for this episode. Next, we're going to focus on UI. See you then.